Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to check out things way off the beaten path that you might not know about, but if you did, they would make a serious impact on your life. This is our 199th Bible Decode here in a row, all coming from the New Testament so far. And we've been exploring the ins and outs of the Roman origins hypothesis of the New Testament, that the New Testament was written by the Romans, not by a bunch of illiterate, apostles who spoke Aramaic. The Gospels are written in Greek, and that is one of the two languages of the Romans. The Caesars, and in particular the Caesars from the Flavian dynasty, that is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, from 69 until 96 AD. The theory goes that their court, their agents, that they wrote the Gospels and backdated the story by 40 plus years, putting Jesus's ministry in the late 20s, early 30s. And at the same time, they wrote a history in 7 volumes of the war that they had just taken part in, the war against the Jews, called Jewish War, from 66 until 73 AD. Both General Vespasian and General Titus were wounded in the war, but that didn't stop them from ultimately destroying the Jews and laying waste to Jerusalem under General Titus in 70 AD. By that time, General Vespasian had become the new emperor. And this was a long pattern, this war. The Jews, for the last 130 years, ever since the Romans pulled in 63 BC, they had been constantly warring and revoluting and insurrecting and rioting, and there's a couple more, against the Romans because of their separatist religion and their jealous and zealous God that called them the chosen people, the God had a obsessive compulsive disorder, which required 1 million different rituals to be followed, circumcision and strictures against graven images due to his insecurity, and all the kosher food laws and the animal sacrifice, which was to feed his smoking addiction to animal fat. And God was also arbitrary and capricious, indecisive, and impotent, meaning that he needed to take a rest every 7 days. And the Jews had to follow all this rigmarole, and they were willing to die in order to maintain all of this. For the Romans, that was translated into high maintenance and too many resources being dedicated to these Jews, while we have dozens of other races and tribes that we have to govern as well, but we're spending way too much time, looking after the Jews. And so they took advantage of the fact that the Jews were literally waiting for a Messiah from the Old Testament prophecies, and that Messiah was a military commander who would help them throw out the Romans. And so the Romans wrote a story of a Jewish Messiah who instead was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and turning the other cheek to oppression, and walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, and so on, while at the same time overturning the tables of the money changers outside the temple and excoriating the other Jews who were selling small animals for the sacrifice inside the temple. So Jesus is taking direct aim at the Jewish tradition while being totally deferential toward Rome, which he does right throughout the Gospels with zero exceptions. And his popularizer, Paul, is even worse in terms of being pro-Roman. And there's a lot of more evidential proof of all of this, that this book that they wrote about the war, which was called Jewish War and written under the name of Josephus, who, any way you slice it, was an agent of the Romans, of the Caesars, emanating from Caesar's palace. That book has so many parallels between it and the Gospels that it is obvious that they were written by the same entity. And since we know who that entity was in the case of War of the Jews, we can add 2 and 2 and figure out that the New Testament was also written by the Romans, at least the Gospels. I would also argue all of it, but we'll just be conservative that way. And you can see the parallels in Legion. They include over 40 events that show that the 3-year military campaign of Titus is copied by the 3-year ministry of Jesus. Every place that Titus goes in the pages of the War of the Jews in his military campaign, Jesus also goes. And they go to these places in the same order. And at each place they encounter a parallel event that is spaced exactly 40 years apart. We're talking over 40 separate events, all fitting those parameters. There aren't any real odds for that. But whatever those odds are, they are add another 50 zeros, and then you can get Michael Menescot's new book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. He goes into the book of Luke looking for parallels with War of the Jews and finds over 250 of them. Just in the book of Luke. That's over 10 per chapter. I mean, that's over 10 per chapter. And some of the parallels are utterly obvious, and some of them are quite devastating in their mean-spiritedness, their mocking, ridiculing of anybody who believes what they've written. Joseph Atwill, author of Caesar's Messiah, calls it the world's first intelligence test. And if you fail the test, your punishment is that you believe in a false god, or I would say false god, that being Jesus or Satan. Both of them were created by the Romans, and there are a handful of mentions of Satan in the Old Testament, but he's always really the adversary or the obstacle, and is a human, not like a supernatural being. That is where the Romans came in. And anyway, Menescot's found these over 250 parallels, and he graphed them on a chart putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. He plotted all 250 points, and he made 5 almost perfect letters of the same size in Latin. And that, Greek was kind of like the common language in Rome, and Latin was the language of the elite, or the Caesars. They signed their name to the book of Luke, APTVS, the TV for Titus and Vespasian, the AP maybe for Agion Pneuma, which means Holy Spirit, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And that could have been pointing at Domitian, the younger brother. Or perhaps it's Aries Piso, who was a shadow player behind the scenes of a number of different Roman emperors. And Roman Piso, as well as Abelard Reuchlin, both argue independently of each other that it was not only Arius Piso who wrote the New Testament, but the rest of his family also contributed. It was really like the family business, and they wrote all of the New Testament in addition to a whole lot of other stuff, like all of the church fathers, all of the Apocrypha, and even some classical, science and invention, like this guy named Hero of Alexandria, who created all these things that they used in the church to deceive people. They wrote the Gospels really as a play, a series of plays that were to be performed in front of the people. Arius Piso was like he played Jesus, and when he wasn't doing that, he played Joseph, he played Peter, and he played Satan. And his children played the apostles. And Paul was played by Pliny the Younger, who probably wrote, along with some of the Pisos, all of the epistles at a later date. Now we're going into another work by a different set of authors who don't know really anything about this Roman origins hypothesis. I think this book came out in 2006, and Joseph Atwill's book came out in 2005. So they theoretically could have had access to Atwill's book, but it seems to me that they don't. But they argue much the same thing, but they don't make the leap to the Romans wrote the New Testament. Instead, they arrive at the conclusion that Paul was a spy for the Romans. So he was an agent of the Romans. So instead of saying that it was all a psychological operation done by the Romans, they're just saying that Paul's life, they believe that Paul actually existed, and that in his life he was an intelligent agent. And now we're right in the introduction here. This book was written, incidentally, by Thies Voskillen and Rosemary Sheldon. And it's called Operation Messiah. And in the introduction, they list a number of questions that they are using as kind of their method of analysis. And I'm going to go over those questions and then head to the next section of the intro. So what in the text does not happen in a normal situation? What in the text does not happen that in a normal situation would have been natural or likely to happen? So this is how you kind of detect where a spy might be involved, or where there's an operation going on. You can think of this in terms of a lot of the psyops that you see, false flags and, inside jobs and so on, that what does not happen that would be likely to happen. a lot of times it has to do with the police standing down, like, or the camera not working, or, you know, that kind of thing. It does not happen. But normally it would, the camera was on all day, but then when the actual event happened, it happened to have been off. Okay, so the next one is, what type of information does the writer not give, contrary to his information elsewhere? Which aspects of the story does Luke highlight, and which ones does he ignore, gloss over, or forget to mention? Is there a pattern to these irregularities? Okay. Now he says, these are the kind of questions that can end a scholarly career or prevent one from starting. Nevertheless, we have asked them. Our book is divided into 10 chapters, each of which focuses on an aspect of Paul's career. In the first two, we have discussed security issues in the crucible of revolutionary Palestine and where the Jesus movement fits into this picture. Chapter 3 and 4 discuss what little we know of Paul's origins and why very little can be known of his early life. Was Paul born a Jew? Was he a convert to Judaism? Was he ever Jewish at all? Was he hiding something? Chapter 5 examines his conversion on the road to Damascus and his subsequent actions. Chapter 6 covers his varied travels throughout the empire. Chapter 7 details Paul's visit to Jerusalem and his confrontation with the Nazarene elders. Chapter 8 analyzes Paul's trial in Jerusalem. Chapter 9 discusses the historicity of Paul's supposed death in Rome. Chapter 10 summarizes what was made of Paul's teachings in late antiquity and where our research fits in with the historiographical work on Paul. The epilogue presents our conclusions about the mysterious Paul of Tarsus. All right, well, that sounds pretty good. I've read this book before, but I think I'm going to appreciate it a lot more this time because, you know, when you read the New Testament, they throw all of these characters at you, all of these names, just, you know, especially in Paul's epistles, where he's giving shout outs to people, but you don't really know who they are. But if you pay attention to that stuff, you can really get a lot more depth into the understanding, because a lot of those people that he's calling out are like Roman nobility and even Roman rulers. But even so, whoever they are, it's good to kind of understand who these different characters are. But when you usually, unless you really study the New Testament, a lot of those different characters kind of just go in one ear and out the other, or one eye, two eyes, whatever. Are we falsifying the story by appealing to a critical sense of thinking about the intelligence ramifications? Not really. All reconstructions are, by definition, acts of historical imagination. All we can produce here is a credible narrative based on the scanty sources and placed into the context of the political reality, the social world of the first century Mediterranean and military context of the time. Our speculation is not an attempt to slander the chief apostle, first among saints, the church's greatest pastor and its theological warrior. We are simply questioning the historicity of some attempts to fill in the gaps of Paul's life, as no doubt others will question ours. This book aspires to pursue a road less traveled about the question of Paul's activities and his relationship to the Roman military establishment. Those wishing a more traditional view may choose from a great variety of books offered by devotional presses. This book is not one of them. You know, just basically making a delineation between history and theology. If you want to believe something by blind faith, you're completely welcome to. But if you step into the realm of history, blind faith does not cut it. You need to have evidence that is explainable in, you can't just resort to supernatural explanations, especially when there are rational explanations that would also explain the same events. But our history often does slip into that. Not just the, history of religious stuff, but also, many scientists think of their science as religion. They capitalize it. Evolution or climate change. And, as a result, they use cognitive dissonance on events and evidence that doesn't go their way. And, they are unable to see what they're doing. Okay, this is chapter 1. It's called Roman Intelligence and Security in First Century Palestine. The backdrop of Paul's story is the Roman occupation of Judea and Rome's security problems in that turbulent province. After an unsuccessful try at using client kings, the Romans declared Judea a province in 6 CE and appointed a governor or procurator. A rebellion broke out immediately, led by Judas of Galilee and Zadok, the Pharisee. Although Judas was killed and the Romans crushed the rebellion decisively, the insurrection went underground. The period between those events and the breakout of full-scale war between the Jews and the Romans in 66 CE saw the death of Jesus, the ministry of Paul, and the birth of Christianity. If you're using the Roman origins hypothesis, none of those three things occurred between that time period. But if you go with the Bible, which is the only source on this, then you can get to the death of Jesus, the ministry of Paul, and the birth of Christianity. So they're kind of already sort of violating their own, kind of academic standards or method of analysis here by giving credence to what's written in the New Testament when there isn't any corroborating, evidence. Because all of the corroborating evidence of the existence of Jesus, all of it is from the Romans. Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Emperor Trajan, and Suetonius, who may or may not have been Emperor Antoninus Pius. This is all of the evidence that Jesus existed for the first 100 years after his so-called death. Okay, but now we're back in the early to mid first century. The 60-year gap between the outbreak of Judas's rebellion and the Great Jewish War saw periods of stability and then a gradual deterioration of relations between the Jews and the Romans. Since no rebellion is truly spontaneous, there were political and social reasons for the unrest, which finally built up into the mass discontent that produced the leadership for the outbreak of the war. The reasons for the discontent are not hard to find. The Jews suffered from many of the ills displayed by other native peoples occupied by the Romans. They were heavily taxed and lost their lands when many areas were incorporated into the large estates of the upper classes. There was enforced urbanization and a disintegration of village life, exploitation, agricultural dispossession, and the mounting debt of the landless, who had to watch their own ruling class getting richer while remaining unconcerned with the vast majority of the Judean population. As the rich, well-fed collaborators prospered, successive messianic prophets rose up from among the people and promised apocalyptic deliverance. A radicalization of at least a segment of the population caused revolutionary groups to be formed. It was the job of the Romans to identify those groups and keep them from growing or spreading their influence. They used the Jewish elite to control the rising popular discontent, and it was only when the Jewish upper classes lost that control in 66 CE that the priests threw in their lot with the common people at the last minute. I'm not really that sure about that last part. I mean, a lot of the Jewish elite, especially the Herods. Now, the Bible said the Herods were Idumeans, and that kind of implies that they were partially Jewish. But there's some good evidence out there that the Herods were Hasmonean, or from the Maccabee dynasty that ruled the Jews, that were Jews and ruled the Jews in the second century to early 1st century BC. But the Herods, they didn't throw in their lot with the common people at the last minute. They jumped ship and fled back to Rome. And I think a lot of the Jewish upper classes did that. Okay, this section is called Roman Intelligence Assets. In order to maintain internal security, track the movements of insurgents, and even infiltrate revolutionary groups in Judea, the Romans needed an intelligence apparatus. Rome's ability to collect the intelligence it needed was at best an ad hoc affair. At no point in Roman history was there a single centralized intelligence service centered on the capital like the one operated by the Persians. During the Republic, most of Rome's intelligence was collected by the army. Exploratores acted as scouts in the field. Speculatores were used as collectors, undercover agents, messengers, and even assassins. In Rome itself, most upper-class families maintained informal networks of spies to keep themselves informed of important political and social developments. Once an upper-class Roman was elected to office, the military machinery would be at his disposal. By the time of Emperor Augustus, which is 27 BC until 14 CE, a governmental transportation system called the cursus publicus was added to carry intelligence from the provinces to the emperor in Rome. Under successive emperors, new organizations were added, such as the Frumentarii under Domitian, who was the last Flavian emperor, or Hadrian, which was all the way into the early 2nd century, 117 to 138. This unit was housed in the Castra Peregrina, or the foreigners' camp, on the Celian Hill in Rome. These men were legionary soldiers who acted as couriers between the provincial capitals and Rome. But they could also be assigned duties that included tax collecting, espionage, and political assassination. A second organization was established by Diocletian in the 3rd century CE called the Agentes de Inrebus. He reorganized the corps of agentes into civilian organization under the jurisdiction of the Master of Offices. Neither of these organizations existed, however, in the early decades of the 1st century. What did the Roman intelligence establishment in Judea look like? And what groups did it identify as threats to the rule in Palestine? The internal security needs of a governor like Pontius Pilate were clear. He needed to keep the peace, see that taxes were collected regularly, keep Roman property safe, and guard Roman interests. Like most Roman administrators, Pilate probably served as his own intelligence chief and then delegated tasks to his staff, whose job it was to be sure the governor knew what he needed to know. This was no easy job in Judea. Pilate needed sources and information gatherers of many kinds, and his sources were limited. Apart from his military staff, he could use the high priest and the Jewish administrators of Jerusalem and the temple police, who found it in their best interest to cooperate with the Roman authorities. On the lowest level were paid informers, the Jewish quislings. Any opportunists who could offer useful information were of interest to the Romans.